These are the materials we'll be using in today's lesson. There's a list in the video description. These are the paint colors I'll be using in today's painting. You don't need these exact colors, just use what you have and get close. Also in the video description is a line drawing that you can download and print from home. Once you've printed it at the scale you plan on painting it, I want you to flip the line drawing over, take a pencil, and rub graphite all over the back of the line drawing. Once you've done that, you're going to position it on top of your watercolor paper so the graphite is touching the top of your sheet. Once it's in place, tape it down so it does not shift, and then carefully trace the line drawing using a ballpoint pen. If you apply the right amount of pressure, you should get a medium gray with these lines all on your watercolor paper. Once you're done transferring, remove your line drawing and set it aside. I have gone ahead and transferred my line drawing, and I've gone the extra step of applying masking fluid. The masking fluid I use is this particular brand. I find it easily visible when I'm applying it, and I just think it works great. The only downside is you don't want to leave this masking fluid on your paper too long. If you are at a week or more, you run the risk of the masking fluid staying on your paper permanently. So just be aware of that. In order to apply my masking fluid, I put a small amount of water into a plastic cup, and I just put Dawn dish soap, just a small amount, inside the water. Once I have the soapy water, I coat my paintbrush with the water, and then I simply dip into my masking fluid and apply. Once everything is dry, then I can begin my painting. So if you need to, I recommend pausing the video so you can kind of see where I've applied my masking fluid so you can kind of replicate the same thing. Meanwhile, I'm going to begin mixing my paint colors for the background. To begin mixing, I'm just going to apply some clean water in a few areas of my palette. I'm just using a large brush to kind of move that water from my cup over to my palette. I like to use a variety of colors and values just to add some interest to my background. So I'm filling about 4 or 5 wells with some color, or I should say with water. One of the first colors I'm going to use is Cerulean Blue. I want to make sure I use enough pigment so that it's nice and vibrant. Because I will be painting my background using the wet into wet technique, I know that my color is going to be about 20% lighter when it dries, just because of the technique and all the water involved. So I like to mix my colors to be extra vibrant early on. So I'm just taking a moment to mix a variety of different blues. So I have one that is about 50% cerulean blue and 50% ultramarine. I'm going to have another mixture that is ultramarine blue, but I'm going to add some purple lake into it so it turns more of a grape purple. I also want to have one that is just straight ultramarine blue. And I'm going to do another mixture that is ultramarine blue with some added sap green. So it's a little bit more of a teal color. So the ultramarine blue and the sap green is just a really pretty color. So I will probably be using that color the most in this first layer of the background. Once I have all of my colors mixed up, if I'm confident in my color mixing, then I'll move on to adding water to the background. You may want to test out your color values on a scrap piece of paper just to make sure that they are dark enough for what you're going for. Now my masking fluid has completely dried. Now I'm going to apply clean water using the largest brush I have. This is definitely not a watercolor brush, but it gets the job done. I just want to completely saturate this background, and I want to go around my moth so the water doesn't go inside. Now the first layer of water we apply to our paper is going to be absorbed pretty quickly. So I have to be pretty heavy-handed and liberal with the first layer of water. Since I'm working on a watercolor block, just the way the block is designed with adhesive on all four sides, it's kind of minimizing all of the wrinkles that the paper would typically go under if it wasn't secured flat. It still bows a little bit, but it sure makes painting a lot easier. And it avoids the hassle of having to stretch my paper every single time I sit down to paint. Okay, so I'm going to let this water sit for maybe 30 seconds just to absorb into the fibers of the paper. Once I feel confident that it is no longer drying too quickly, I'm going to use my large square brush, dry it out, and once it's dry, I'm going to go around the outer edges of my block where water typically puddles, and I'm just going to even out the water. I want everything nice and glossy, but I do not want real thick puddling because that's just going to cause frustration and make it hard for me to control where my paint goes. Once you've evened out your water and you feel happy with it, then you're going to grab your large round brush and begin applying color. Now, I have decided to add salt into my background just for a textural element, and you are welcome to do the same. I will actually be using a margarita salt, believe it or not, but I need to first get my paint colors down before I involve that. So the first color I'm going to include is a cerulean blue. So I'm going to keep my cerulean blue rather central through my little painting here. And notice how I didn't just go straight across. I want some texture and different heights. So I just kind of dabbed my brush just to get some variety. Now I'm going to grab my lighter value of the ultramarine blue. And I'm just dabbing in some color at different heights to create some texture. And I can't get too fussy this early because things want to dry fast. Once I have that down, I'm going to grab some of my darker ultramarine blue. And I'm just dabbing it across. Now I'm going to be getting my ultramarine blue with that sap green, and this is one of my favorite color combinations. So I'm going to be more heavy-handed with this particular color all across the bottom section of this painting. I want some good saturation of this color. Also with this color, I want to kind of get different heights and textures. I don't want it all just one note. So I am bringing some of that up into the ultramarine blue randomly. Now, before I get too worried about details, I need to do a couple things. One is I'm going to rinse my brush and remove the excess water from my brush by tapping it on a sponge. Now that my brush is just damp, I'm going to use my brush as a blending tool. So I'm going to come to this top edge where my paint colors are, and I'm just using little circular motions to kind of bring that color up a little further into the background. I still want different heights, and I still want some texture. So I'm trying not to make it too symmetrical. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please hit that subscribe button and give me a thumbs up. Now I'm going to water down some Cerulean Blue, so it's a real nice light value, and I'm just going to put a really light wash across the top here. Before I get too far, I'm going to add some Purple Lake to just a few areas of the background because I want some variety. I'm going to water down some of this Purple Lake as well and put just a touch of it into the sky. Now, before I drop the salt, I'm just going to absorb some of the puddling I have in my background. So I'm just drying my brush off on my sponge or paper towel, and I'm just tapping the surface of my paper where there is puddling of paint and water. I just want to even that out a bit, especially on the edges of the watercolor block, because that is often where you will get a blooming texture if you are not careful. Blooms are beautiful, but you don't want them to sneak up on you. So I'm drying my brush, going all around the edges of my block with my dry brush, and just soaking up that excess paint. Now, everything is very glossy right now, which is wonderful. That's what I want. I'm going to grab a little pinch of my margarita salt, and I'm just going to sprinkle it across the top of my painting. I'm not bringing it down too far into my other colors. And then before I consider this first layer done, I am going to use just a damp brush to kind of push and pull some of my color around. To do some blending. To make sure that my moth really stands out, I want to make sure to get some darker colors around the moth just so it really kind of pops off the page. So I'm using that mixture of sap green and viridian hue just to darken up the area that is closest to the moth. Now, because of the ultramarine, I've got some really wonderful texture in my background, and that's because that pigment is a granulating pigment. So it really kind of adds some fun, unexpected textures. Now I'm just going to sit here for a little moment. I'm going to let some of this paint begin to dry. And the moment I see the glossy sheen begin to dull, I'm going to use a small brush just to add some loose vertical thin stem textures to imply grasses and plants. But if I do it too soon, while things are too wet, my lines will become very wide, and that's not my goal. I want some nice narrow lines that just add a change of texture, but don't bleed too much into the background. So I need to wait until the sheen of some of these areas kind of calms down a bit. I'm doing my best not to touch any areas that have salt because I want that salt to kind of create texture. And what it's going to do is wherever the salt crystals sit on my wet surface, they're going to absorb the paint that they are sitting on. And if you allowed enough time, once it dries completely, those little salt crystals can be brushed away to leave little white starburst-like textures across your paper surface. All right, so it's looking like down towards the bottom third of my painting, the gloss is a little less. So if I tip my paper, I hope you can kind of see that. Midway where my moth is, things look quite a bit glossy still, so I don't know that that's an area I want to draw any lines in. But I'm going to grab the smallest brush I have, and I just want to get some textures in here. So I'm going to use that ultramarine blue with sap green, but I want a really dark version of it. So I'm getting more paint into my mixture. And when I load my brush, I really make sure to wipe the excess paint off my brush. I'll even go a step further and lightly tap my sponge just in case. This is going to help ensure that my line work is small. So I'm going to first just kind of start below my moth, and I'm just going to drag one line in one stroke. And I'm trying to do this without stopping. If I don't make it all the way to the bottom of the page, that's okay. But I want to get some lines into my paper while it's at this stage before it dries. You can be kind of random at this stage, but just look at your painting and ask yourself, okay, where am I lacking a variety of values? Where am I lacking texture or different colors? And that's typically a great location to add some lines to break it up. I'm going to tap my brush with this color to give the illusion of some blurred buds that are in the background. But I want these buds to be at different angles and sizes. So some of them I might kind of tap my brush to create an oblong shape at an angle, and some might be vertical. And I'm finding these kind of empty spaces in my background that I feel like are lacking a little extra detail. But once I've established where I want them, I'm not going to worry too much about the blooms. I'm going to embrace that. But I am going to try and add some stems. There are some areas of my paper that are already beginning to dry, so I'm trying to be aware of them. If you have absolutely no gloss on that area of the paper, it's probably best that you stay out of that area with your color for now. So I'm sticking to just the areas that have a sheen. All right, things are starting to get really dry. So I need to kind of stop here and stop playing. Any additional details that I want to achieve, I can do that on the next layer. So I'm going to stop the video here, let things dry. I cannot use the blow dryer without messing up the salt effect. So unfortunately, I have to just walk away and come back to it in probably 15-30 minutes to do the next step. Now that everything is completely dry, I'm going to use my hands just to brush away some of this salt. And you can see the texture that it left behind. And I did this just because I thought it would be a more interesting background than just a plain soft white or soft blue. Okay. So now that everything is dry, I'm going to paint wet on dry and just add some additional details. I'm going to start with just my small number 6 round. And I'm using a watered down, really light value of the Cerulean Blue. And I want to create just some background buds. And I'm always trying to go different sizes and angles. And I'm just kind of creating these little oval shapes. And I'm just soaking up any excess puddling of paint in these shapes to minimize the built up pigment on the edges through the drying. So I'm going around and I'm going to do this in a few areas. And once these little buds dry, then I'll come in and create some stems for each of them. So I dry my brush off after I make the shape, and I use my dry brush to soak up any puddling of paint. Notice how all my shapes are kind of at different heights. Now I'm going to do the same thing with that ultramarine and sap green color. So that teal color we had mixed up. I'm going to add water to it so it's not very dark. And I'm just going to give a little bit more definition to some of the buds. This is a very light value because I don't want things to get too dark. We also don't want to be afraid of having some buds be behind some of the foreground buds, because that's what's going to help make everything look layered, and it's going to give some dimension. As I move down in this little painting, the colors are a little darker, so I have to occasionally add more paint to my mixture if I want to ensure things show up. So in order to get the right contrast, sometimes you have to darken up your color if you can't see it. Right under the moth here, my color is very camouflaged and similar value, so I have to darken that up a bit. Now with this color, I'm also going to be painting some stems and some grasses. So for the stems, I'm going to use a different brush. I like to use a liner brush. It's going to help me get a nice, long, consistent line without having to stop midway and reload my paint. So this is a Rigger #1 brush. The bristles are probably an inch long. And I'm going to first add some stems to the Cerulean Blue buds that I added first. Once I add some stems to the Cerulean Blue buds, I can choose to add some random just grass blades on their own. I like to always have different heights and angles so it doesn't look too cookie cutter. Focusing on different heights as I'm doing this. I can now go into that teal blue green that I made with the ultramarine blue and the burnt, or ultramarine blue and the sap green, forgive me. I just want to make sure that it's watered down and of similar value that I used on the buds. I don't want it to be too dark. Once I have my color right, I'm just going to add some stems to these other buds that I have in the background. I'm still trying to do all stems and grasses in one stroke. Now I can go ahead and add some additional stems, but I like to have a variety of different colors. So I'm going to do some stems with the ultramarine blue. If you have a stem that looks really abrupt at the beginning or end of the stroke, you can use a brush that is damp and you can just pull that line with your damp brush and you'll kind of get rid of that shape that you didn't like or mean to give. So I'm just coming in with my damp small brush. I'm kind of dragging the end of that line so it kind of fades with the rest of the background. Now I'm going to switch to my small number 6 round. And I just want to get some of these other buds painted in. So this is my ultramarine blue. So I'm going to come in right near my masking fluid here. And if I feel like I don't have enough contrast, I'm going to get more of that ultramarine blue on my paintbrush. And since this brush is larger, when I pull a line, it's going to look a little thicker, which is great because that's going to give the illusion that this bud is closer in the foreground. I'm going to continue using this ultramarine blue to create some of the bud shapes. So I'm just finding where I put masking fluid previously and adding this kind of tubular shape to it. I can add additional buds if I feel an area needs one. Now, before I get too far, I'm going to dry my brush off and soak up some of the thicker puddles of paint in these bud shapes. That's just going to help things dry a little faster. It'll also minimize the built-up pigment that you'll get on the outer edges of your shapes, which is very common in watercolors. And while these shapes are still wet, I can come into the very bottom of that tubular shape and just tap my brush so it releases some of that teal green so I can darken it up as if there's a shadow there. I always think objects look more interesting if you take the time to add multiple values to them. And while some of these shapes are still wet, I'm just going to take that teal, blue, green, add some stems. You can use your liner brush if you prefer, but I feel like my liner brush is very thin and narrow. So for these foreground plants, I just want a little bit of a thicker stem. So I'm kind of just bouncing back and forth between that teal green and the ultramarine blue. So just continue to paint those little buds. Feel free to change up where you put your buds or the number. You don't have to completely do what I do. That's the benefit of being an artist. You can kind of edit and change the rules and just be creative. Bring your own touch to it. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please hit that subscribe button and give me a thumbs up. So I'm just going to take a moment here and try and decide what else I feel like my painting needs. I think I need some more ground texture. I like the idea of adding some more white blurred blooms in the background. So I want to continue working on these buds for now before the moth. As my buds get lower in my painting, that typically reads as closer in the foreground, so I do want to make them a little larger. All right, I'm going to use my number 6 round. And I want to mix up a dark value of that teal green. And with this dark value, I just want to create some ground texture. So I can create some thicker leaves in a few areas. Notice all the different directions I'm going with my leaves. And I'm also continuing to change up the height of them. This is just going to break up the ground texture a little bit more to add some interest. I can do the same thing with other colors. So I'm going to take my Cerulean Blue and I can add other textures as well. So maybe with my Cerulean Blue, we have some smaller leaf type textures or plants, which are just kind of a grouping of dots. And I know this color looks dark when I initially apply it, but from experience, I know that watercolors will dry to be about 20% lighter than what they appear when they're wet. So I'm not too worried that they're going to show up and kind of take the attention away. I'm continuing to add some of this texture, but notice how I'm being asymmetrical with it, and my groupings of dots are varying in shape. I'm going to get some sap green that is just by itself. And I think a filbert brush is going to work well just to add a different type of leaf texture. So a filbert brush typically has a flat with a rounded edge. So I'm just adding some more varying texture. Okay, so while this paint is drying, I'm going to decide where I want a couple more blossoms, but I want them to kind of look like they are blurred. So I'm going to soak up some of these puddles that I created with my texture using a dry brush. I'm going to hit this with the blow dryer, and then I'm going to use a stencil and a Mr. Clean magic eraser to kind of lift up some areas where I could have some blurred white blossoms in the background. Everything's dry. I have a circle template here, and although I don't feel the need to kind of lift perfect circles, it's at least a place to start. So I'm going to get my Mr. Clean magic eraser wet with clean water, and wherever I want a blurred blossom, I'm going to start tapping with this eraser, and it's going to pull up quite a bit of the color. Now keep in mind, with this being a blurred blossom, I don't want a perfect circle. I want there to be some texture to it. So the stencil is really here just to kind of make sure I stay in my zone, but it's not going to determine the shape. So when I lift the stencil up, you can kind of see what the shape is, and note that it's not a perfect circle. It's just there to kind of help make sure I don't overdo it and go too large. All right, so that's my first one. So I'm looking around and trying to decide where else I might benefit some with some bright whites. I'm going to get a smaller stencil so I can get a few smaller shapes that are in the background. So I've lifted a couple larger shapes in the foreground, but now I want to kind of lift some in the background here. So maybe there's one over here on the left. And again, try not to be perfect with it. I have to kind of make sure I'm in an area with enough color that this lifting technique actually shows up. Sometimes water kind of gets underneath the stencil, so I just have a little bit of a paper towel to dab just to keep that under control. Just letting the water do the work. All right, the other thing I can do is I can use a filbert or square brush, and I can actually choose to keep my brush as vertical as possible, and just using a wet brush, I can lift out some grass textures that are in the foreground. So a lot of times we feel like we need to just keep layering and layering, but a lot of times that leads to a painting that is just too dark. Sometimes we have to remind ourselves that if you're using the right tools, you can actually lift out some highlights to brighten up your painting. A lot of times I like to take my painting and just kind of set it on a shelf or mantle and keep my distance and just kind of look at it over a couple days to figure out what the painting needs, whether it's a highlight or a dark or a different texture. You just have to kind of be patient. Some paintings aren't fast. They take time. All right, I'm going to define a little bit darker shadows on some of these stems and buds. In order to do that, I can use either my deep grape purple, or I can just get a little bit of Payne's gray, just the smallest amount, into some of the ultramarine blue. And I can use this to create some shadows. So the first thing I want to do is I'm going to leave the masking fluid on my moth for now. Everything else has dried. So I'm just going to rub my fingers across the areas that have masking fluid in them to get that up off the paper. If any of the masking fluid is being a little stubborn and it doesn't want to come up, you can use what is called a rubber cement pickup, which is just kind of a rubber block. And this block is going to help you pick up some of that more stubborn masking fluid that might be stuck under layers of paint. You just kind of use it like an eraser, and the masking fluid will stick to the edges of this little pickup. And you know what? I feel like it's safe to remove the masking fluid from the moth. So I'm going to go ahead and just do that as well. I know from experience that a rubber cement pickup and masking fluid will lift all the pencil lines. So I'm trying to keep my rubber cement pickup just to where my masking fluid is, so I don't completely lose all of these guidelines that I had drawn out or transferred earlier. So I'm brushing all that masking fluid off and away. I really want to make sure nothing is stuck. Looks like I got a couple paint drops that I need to lift. So to lift those paint drops, I'm just using a wet brush, and I'm scrubbing with water. And that's going to lift up these little paint droplets. And once I get color on my moth, I won't be able to see these. All right, so in these buds that we lifted, we need at least some kind of color and value so they don't look flat. So I'm just getting some watered down cerulean blue. And I'm just coming into these buds, and I'm staying away from the blurred ones. I'm focusing on the ones that have the hard edges from the masking fluid. And I'm just adding a little bit of value to them. Now, while that first layer of cerulean blue is drying, I'm going to get a slightly darker mixture of blue paint, and I don't want to completely cover up the whites, but just a touch here and there of a little bit of a darker shadow is going to give a little bit more dimension to these little flowers. This blossom in the back here, I just want to soften some of the edges where that cerulean blue meets with some of the white. Now I can go to that darker blue and Payne's gray mixture to add a little bit more shadows to some of these blossoms. Usually right at the top where the flower is coming out of the bud, there's a shadow created by that bloom. So that's where I'll put some of these darks. Sometimes it could be nice to have a second brush that is just lightly damp with water to help blend some of the shadows. I'm also trying to make sure that the top edge of these buds, where it meets up with the flower, that there's some texture in kind of this zigzagged edge. So I'm just using that damp brush to kind of pull and blend some of that color. But these foreground buds, they're kind of one of the focal points, so I want to take my time with them. And a damp brush really helps just kind of blend some of those colors. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please hit that subscribe button and give me a thumbs up. The blurred blossoms, I'm just going to use a damp brush to just make sure that the edge where the bud meets up with the blossom is irregular. I just don't want that to look too circular or flat. So I'm just using a little scrubbing method with a wet small brush just to kind of change that up. All right, now we're going to begin working on that moth. If you don't have any room left on your palette, you can get a new palette. And right now, I just want to kind of get a base color on this moth. So I'm going to apply clean water using my number 6 round. If your water accidentally goes outside the shape of your moth, just dab with a paper towel. All right. Now that my moth is wet, I'm going to use some burnt sienna on the outer edge of all the wings. And I really just try to slow down when I'm at my edges so I have a neat product. I try to really hold my brush vertical and keep my pressure really, really light to the point where my brush bristles aren't even bending. And that allows me to get right up close to the edge without kind of going outside of it. I have some puddling of the paint through the center of the moss, so I'm just drying my brush on my sponge so I can soak that up. While that burnt sienna is drying, I'm going to use some Cerulean Blue for the body of the moth. I don't want to overload my brush with too much blue because I don't want it to kick back and bloom and push away all of the burnt sienna that I have there. I need to make sure whatever value of blue I use on my moth, that it is darker than the blue of the background nearby. That way it doesn't completely camouflage in. Now this is just my first layer, and some parts of the wing where the burnt sienna was is already beginning to dry. So I really need to kind of get out, and any additional details are going to have to be finished on the next layer. So to speed things up, I'm just going to dry this with a blow dryer. Now that everything's dry, I'm going to get the same blue I used, but I'm going to paint wet on dry. And I just want to push the values that are on the back side of the moth. And notice how I'm kind of creating a texture in the front half of the moth so it kind of looks fuzzy. And then I'm just pulling that color out more into the wing. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a damp brush with just some clean water. I make sure it's not dripping with water though. So notice how I dragged my brush across the sponge. And I'm just pulling this color out more into the wing so it can blend a little bit. I'm okay with there being some texture, but I just want it to kind of blend a bit more. So I'm coming in with my small brush. And I'm continuing to darken up the blues on this back wing, and that's going to help push the body of the moth forward. Now on the bottom side of the moth, I'm going to be doing the opposite. I want the wing on the left of the moth to be lighter in value. So I'm coming in with this small brush, creating some texture. And I'm staying on the body. And yes, there are some whites on this moth, but I actually plan on adding those at the end. So I'm coming in and just creating some fuzzy texture by dabbing and tapping my brush in random strokes. While that's drying, I'm going to bring some of this blue into the areas of the wing that are already dry. And I'm just going to create some fun textures. So I'm just doing some dots. I don't want them all evenly spaced. So sometimes they're close together. As I move out into the oranges, my dots are a little bit more spaced out. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please hit that subscribe button and give me a thumbs up. I'm going to do this on the wing that is closest to us. I'm going to check that the area of blue on the right wing is completely dry. If it is, then I can bring in some of this texture right on top of this dry blue. I'm going to get a small amount of Payne's Gray. I want to really make sure it's watered down and not too heavy. I'm going to add some Cerulean Blue to it. And I've watered it down so it's more of a medium gray. And as long as the moth's body is dry, I can come in and add just a hint of some darker shadows to some of that little fuzzy texture that he has on his body. To give more contrast between the body and the back wing, I can put some of this Payne's Gray and Blue mixture right behind, and I can just use a damp brush to kind of pull that color out and blend it. Now I'm going to grab some of that ultramarine blue. I'm going to mix that in with that soft Payne's Gray and Blue mixture, and it's going to create more of a darker brown. And this is the color I need for some of the veining on the leaves, or not the leaves, but on the wings. But I can't do the veins unless everything is completely dry. So I'm going to hit this with the blow dryer. Now I'm using my small brush with this dark brown, and I want to add some of these veins to the moth's wings. I have to go really slow and keep my pressure really light in order to keep these lines small and thin. If you don't quite have your brush control down yet for this, you could also use a brown micron pen, and that would be able to get your veins in. If one of the veins on the wings ends abruptly, just rinse your brush, put a little bit of water on it, and just drag the end of that line out. So I'm just continuing to trace these veins. If any areas don't feel dark enough, you can just do a second layer. You can even use this dark brown for some of the shadows on the body as well, just for color harmony. It brings some of those browns into other areas of the moth. I'm going to get some of the Payne's Gray. This is going to be a much darker mixture, but I only need the tiniest bit. This is going to be used for the eyes of the moth. So when I load my brush with this dark Payne's Gray, I really make a point to wipe off the excess to ensure that I have barely any paint on my brush, and that's going to help ensure I get real small marks. And I am being feather light with my touch. If I feel like there's some areas that need more shadow within the fuzz of the body, now's the time while I have this color on. I can even darken up a few areas of the wings if I feel like the brown just wasn't dark enough in a few areas. I'm adding just small little veins towards the end of the wings. Now I'm going to add some bright whites for highlights, and I'm going to do the antenna. So for the antenna, I'm just going to do burnt sienna with a small brush, wiping away the excess paint, keeping my pressure feather light so I can get those thin lines in. I'm now going to use some bleed-proof white for some highlights, so it looks like we have some fuzzy edges to the moth. So I'm just cleaning my brush off and coming right in to this jar of white. And this is just more opaque than a titanium watercolor or a white gouache. That's why I like it. And I want to create a thin line around the outside edge of the wing. So I'm trying not to touch the wing. I'm staying on the background. So I'm going around that outer edge. And once I have that outer edge kind of outlined, I'm just going to tap my brush and do my best to create this little fuzzy texture to the wing. It's easy to go too big with this step though, so just really keep a light touch. And rather than dragging your brush for the marks, just think about tapping little dots. I'm going to do the same thing on the next part of the wing. I'm going to outline it, staying on the background, kind of going around the outside edge. Creating that white. Once I have that outline, then I can kind of come through and tap my brush to create that texture. Once I have the wings outlined, giving that glow, now I can come into the fuzz on the actual body of the moth and just get a little bit more of that contour. So I'm just tapping my brush and creating dots in this real subtle curved line. As I move up the body, there's less and less whites. So I try to be real sparing and selective. And that completes today's painting. I hope you all enjoyed it. Give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and let me know your thoughts in the comments. Have a fantastic day.